Chris Batten received his education from Maidstone College of Osteopathy from 1985 to 1989 under the late John Wernham, who was a student of John Martin Littlejohn, who was an early student of Andrew Taylor Still, the founder of osteopathy. Christopher has taught pathology and osteopathic principles and applied mechanics of the spine and pelvis at Maidstone College of Osteopathy since 1991. From 1991 to 93, he taught at the John Wernham International Academy of Classical Osteopathy at St Joris-Weert, or Weert, just out Leuven in Belgium, where he taught in their undergraduate program until moving there for a full-time position teaching and running the busy undergraduate clinic. In 1999, he was asked to teach at the postgraduate level. Then in 2000, Christopher made co-chairman of the Institute of Classical Osteopathy and was asked to write its newsletter and later to take over running the postgraduate course under John Wernham. In 2001, he changed roles to Secretary of the Institute of Classical Osteopathy and Director of Education. He began a life of the travelling lecturer, teaching at various venues throughout Europe, Canada, Japan and Russia, which is what he still does. So that's already on there. So, good evening, everyone. This is Robert Cartwright, the Vice Chairman of the Institute of Classical Osteopathy, on our first ever interview with one of the best osteopaths I've ever met, a chap called Christopher Batten, who any of you who are familiar with the Institute of Classical Osteopathy and have been to any lectures or any training there will know Chris well. Chris, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good, good. And you're living in Canada now?
Yes, Toronto.
And practicing over there?
Yes, yeah, just sort of fairly recently started. It took me a while to get used to the place and get legal and all the rest of it.
So how did you first hear of osteopathy? What was your kind of first exposure to osteopathy when you were younger?
Well, I started at the college when straight out of school. I was originally looking to do languages at university, and opportunity came to look into osteopathy, and I dove into it. It wasn't something I'd thought about before, other than my own personal experience of having acupuncture. And I sort of, from that, kind of got a bit of an interest in alternative medicine, and yeah, that's what started me off.
How old were you when you had acupuncture?
About 10, 11.
Okay. I trained as an acupuncturist. I wouldn't say it's not my strong point, acupuncture really. I trained as acupuncture as soon as I graduated as an osteopath, and I think I was a bit burnt out, but the guy I worked for was an acupuncturist and I felt it was kind of what I should do next. But I mainly use it as an adjunctive to pain. I don't really do much TCM. Were you having it for a kind of medical problem?
Yeah. No, I had asthma and eczema at the time, and
Okay.
we'd given up on the medical profession because they were worse than useless. In fact, they were making me sick. And yeah, we'd recommended for this, so I had no idea what it was I was letting myself in for, and yeah, that's how it all started.
How did you find it as a 10-year-old having needles stuck in you?
Most of it, no problem. The guy used quite a bit of moxa on my chest
Yeah,
for the asthma, and found that
yeah,
quite relaxing
yeah.
and soothing.
Mm.
It was in the days before all these disposable needles, and so we had a collection of different types of needles.
Mm.
And yeah, the only thing I didn't like, there's a thing called a plum blossom hammer that they use,
Yeah.
which is a
Yeah,
nasty piece of work.
yeah, yeah,
And he'd use that on the skin that was sore to help
yeah,
decongest sort of
yeah,
energetically.
yeah.
But it was
Yes,
that hurt.
yeah. I remember the guy I worked for had, and I remember it being called a 7-star hammer or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was you kind of picked at it, and it was slightly springy, and it would sort of like just tap, and it pretty much just made people bleed, I think. You
Yeah,
know,
it's about clearing the congestion in an area, but
yeah,
and it
yeah,
worked, but yeah,
yeah. It does work,
it's a
but yeah, it's not. It's pretty unpleasant.
it's not the weapon of choice, really.
No, no, no. All right. So that was in. Were you living in Cornwall at the time, or Devon? Sorry,
Devon, yeah, yeah.
Devon. Okay, okay. So how did you first? What? When did you first hear of osteopathy? Did you hear of it as a musculoskeletal type treatment, or was it something that you were drawn to because of your asthma and eczema at a
Um,
particular time?
no, it was. I mean, I knew very little of it when I first sort of, thought about applying to the college.
Yeah.
So did a whole bunch of research, and as you say, it looked like a kind of musculoskeletal thing, although there was hints that it had sort of more depth to it. And it was interesting trying to get involved with the college in Maidstone because there was difficulties getting a grant at the time, and so I nearly didn't start. And the acupuncturist that I'd been to had heard about Mr. Wernham and had some of his yearbooks and said, no, this is the guy to go to specifically.
Mm.
So so I ended up heading into Maidstone. I think it was about a week late or something because of all the trying to sort out grants that never happened and stuff.
So was that the only college that you looked at and you just decided to go to that one, or did you
Yeah,
look at
it was
yeah,
specifically,
yeah.
that we'd seen an ad for the college itself, and was drawn in that direction.
So you how old were you when you started there as an undergraduate?
Would have just been 19.
19. Okay. Okay. So how did you find it? What was it like being an undergraduate at 19, suddenly living away from home?
That was great.
Mm,
A bit of sort of freedom and movement. I had a nice large motorbike at the time, so I used to dash back and forward across the country and dash around the Kent countryside on it. So a bit of a
okay.
whale of a time, really.
Yeah. And so how big were the sort of class sizes at
Oh,
Maidstone?
small. It was a
Yeah.
small little college, so
Yeah.
ours varied because we had some people come and like join in and then left. We had some people that
Yeah.
were in a higher group come down, so it was sort of between 8 and 10. So
Yeah.
quite a
Yeah.
small class, but it worked. It worked doing that.
Yeah.
It was a nice sort of
Okay.
kind of gelled group. There were sort
Yeah.
of ups and downs in sort of people dynamics, but mostly people got on really well and very close knit, really. A lot of us shared a hostel together that Mr. Wernham had got for the students. So
Okay.
quite a few of us actually lived together and ate
Yeah.
together and stuff. So yeah, it was a good setup.
And who did most of the lecturing?
We had a quite a mixed bag. Mr. Wernham lectured us 2-3 times a week.
Mhm.
And otherwise, it was a whole group from the BSO. In fact, again, various people coming and going from the BSO, and quite interesting kind of like blend of quite, if you like, orthodox sort of approach to sort of
Yeah.
osteopathy and osteopathic education, and
Yeah.
kind of whole sort of safety aspect and all that sort of thing, which is obviously sound and valid. And then on the
Yeah.
other hand, we had Mr. Wernham telling us, no, you should be treating pathology and you should be doing this and that. And, Mr. Wernham's kind of line was always kind of like, ask not whether it's a patient for osteopathy, ask what osteopathy can do for the patient.
Mm.
And I, kind of follow that to a fair extent. Obviously, we have boundaries of red flags and safety issues where people need to be, seeking help elsewhere. But equally,
But it's
Wernham gave.
once they're having that help elsewhere, it's good to still be able to support them through whatever that journey is, isn't it?
Yeah, equally. I mean, also, it's like we had an issue with my daughter at one point, and she had febrile convulsion. And my ex at the time, she said she sort of yelped at me to call an ambulance, which is fair dues.
Yeah.
So we called an ambulance, and then I treated her, calmed down, got, stopped the convulsions, and we went in with her into hospital, and they were next to useless. Just gave her a pile of Nurofen, and that was it. That was as much as she got. But it was interesting that the treatment itself managed to quash the convulsions.
That is interesting. It's not just an MSK modality, is it?
No, and something like that is so simple in essence to do. I mean, you wouldn't believe, just following kind of very, very simple principles. I've had a few people with convulsions now, either epileptic or infantile, and simple measures, inhibition 2D to 2L to get control of the overall sympathetics and the vasomotor system as a whole, and suboccipital inhibition. That's it. That if done properly and adroitly, as it were, quashes or seems to quash these convulsions.
It's certainly, recently when Daisy, my daughter, had COVID, doing suboccipital inhibition and working on that junction there, it would immediately drop her temperature. Sometimes at one point from a 1.5 degrees Celsius drop after doing 5 minutes suboccipital inhibition. Going from having a very painful headache and feeling really quite unwell to being quite comfortable and happy again. It's really quite a remarkable thing to be able to do, and it's great because it was the Andrew Taylor Still first ever adjustment. So what a fantastic thing to be good at doing, I think.
Yeah, and what's interesting, treating kids with fevers particularly, or treating anybody with fevers actually, is very often the fever will go up initially and then drop.
Yeah.
And it's like it serves, it's like, Still talks about fever as being a cure in itself, or a treatment in itself. The body is treating itself, and obviously there's times when fevers are far more serious, or they're induced by poisoning of some sort, etc. But most of what you're going to see, especially sort of with kids, is just the immune system working. And what seems to happen is that the treatment frees up the body's response to allow the fever to break, rather than suppressing it. I mean, it's like you say the temperature comes down, but that's not your intent. Your intent is to sort of free the body's mechanisms to deal with it,
do what it needs.
And it's amazing. And I've had that quite a few times with kids over the years, and my kids, and just watched them recover.
It was interesting when Dawn did suboccipital inhibition on me, when I had COVID last week, and my temperature went up by about 0.5 degree after that, so it was balancing the sympathetic and parasympathetic function a bit better to enable my neuroendocrine immune system and brainstem to do what it needed to do to be able to then progress towards recovery.
Yeah, and also, I mean, one of the few bits of research, in osteopathic treatment, if you like, in sort of recent years, showed that inhibition suboccipital actually helps to dilate the peripheral circulation as well. So again, like Little John talks about stimulating the peripheral circulation through the upper thoracic, that in itself, the suboccipital inhibition will help to bring blood to the surface, and of course the temperature with it. Part of the issue with addressing fevers is very often, if somebody's like really sick with it, part of the problem is the blood isn't sufficiently near the surface to allow the heat to dissipate, and the process to sort of run full circle, if you like.
And then you're more likely to get a more acute problem focused in one area rather than it being divided up through the whole kind of anatomy, aren't you?
Yeah, or the body's just not able to generate enough heat to sort of deal with the sort of toxins and microbes and all the rest of it. And this allows that process to occur without so much of a chance of damage. I remember treating my little girl once. She had a fever, and one of the signs you look out for is sort of an indication of a fever being potentially detrimental is the head being hot, the feet cold.
Yeah.
You got a gross imbalance in the circulation. So I just did a very light treatment to stimulate her peripheral circulation. Literally, that we're talking a treatment of about a minute or so. And immediately her temperature went up, but the temperature in her head came down and her feet got warm. And then her temperature kind of went up and down a little bit through the rest of the night, and she was fine. She was absolutely fine after that. It's fascinating, and this is one of the things with this approach to osteopathy. It's it never ceases to be interesting. I think McConnell, one of our kind of early osteopathic writers, talks about the same thing. And Wernham always used to say, if you get bored in your practice, you're not doing it right.
No, absolutely. One of the things that I've found is, each time you get to a certain level, and you think, and then it opens up another doorway, and you've got the sort of the journey through that, and then to whatever that brings, which is for me, I've been an osteopath for 25 years now, and it's really exciting, and I've loved the journey, and it's very stimulating academically and mentally, and it's great being able to help people.
Absolutely, absolutely. The only kind of issue with that, in a sense, is the frustration of not being able to do more of it. And more of that kind of osteopathy.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like,
you're right.
I mean, this whole kind of pandemic period, it would have been so interesting to be, all being well dressed up and all the rest of it, but in a hospital ward.
It would have been. It would have been. The only person I've been able to treat who've had with COVID, and through this thing is Daisy and Dawn, and that was actually quite interesting. With Dawn, when I was again doing some work through the base of her cranium, and she had a really bad headache, but it would oscillate from side to side, and normally it would kind of, if someone's sphenobacilar symphysis would do that, it might go from one side to the other and then back to the middle or back to somewhere and settle, but this was just swinging from side to side, oscillating, not really finding a sort of place of comfort. It was, the vitality was incredibly powerful and active and busy.
I mean, that's one of the key things with the way people deal with fevers. If somebody is like really ill and their like vitality is low, they don't have the capacity necessary to generate the fever that they need to deal with it. Whereas people, kind of often medical profession looks at fever as being in it, and it can be a harmful thing. It can cause brain damage in kids and so on. We're not dismissing that. But not sort of understanding that it has a role in healing what's going on, and B, helping to sort of establish an immune system that works. It's part of that process.
It's not your body going wrong, is it? It's your body trying to sort out and return to some kind of normal homeostasis. So going back to your training, what sort of literature were you sort of pointed towards? What did you have to read, and what were you sort of told that you had to study?
A lot of it was in-house. Mr Wornham was producing and reproducing a lot of the old sort of classic texts of osteopathy. Large emphasis on Little John, and quite a large emphasis on sort of principles, the mechanics and fundamentals of osteopathic technique, which is my most recommended book for anybody learning osteopathy. Which, although is attributed to Little John, was apparently from their lecture notes at the BSO. So there's bits of various people there. But a lot of it's certainly Little John. But of course, we had all the regular anatomy and physiology and pathology and all the rest of it. But those were our osteopathic textbooks largely. So Little John, McConnell, Still, obviously, Mr Wornham was publishing a version of the Still's Research and Practice. And and other, other bits and pieces of McConnell he'd reprinted, and so on. And it was way before we had, kind of internet and access to sort of so many different sort of texts and so on that we do now.
Yeah.
And that was the bulk of it, really.
And one of the notes you sent me over was about some of the material that Littlejohn had been written was to help get through the demands of the Flexner Report. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, well, as far as I understand from Chris Campbell's research, it never seemed to make sense. I think I've sort of put some of this down to you. Mr. Wornham would say to us, don't ask him for a recipe for treating such and such a condition. That's not the way we work. And then, most of our lectures, after we'd done sort of applied anatomy from Littlejohn and mechanics from Wernham and Littlejohn and Hall, which was quite brief, I have to say, it was all pathology. It was all Littlejohn's analysis of pathology and looking at the conditions, sort of subtle details of what they referred to as lesion patterns and changes in sort of anatomical relationships and so on, and then treatment protocols. So it's like, hang on, what are we dealing with here? And the more you sort of look into that, and the more, I there were occasions where I used those lecture notes of Littlejohn to treat conditions like a recipe, in spite of being told that, and they worked infallibly, absolutely infallibly. And the details and the lesion picture he described were always there, and it wasn't like you were looking to find it. Oh, look, there it is. We've been told there it is, and there it is. Sometimes it's kind of slightly hidden. Sometimes it's under layers of other issues going on. So Littlejohn had produced these materials sort of almost contrary to the whole kind of philosophy, but it was to deal with apparently the fact that osteopathic colleges were being kind of restricted or influenced by the results of the Flexner Report, which was a process of looking into the education standards across medicine, throughout the United States. And the process closed down many different schools of sort of what we would refer to as alternative or complementary medicine, but osteopathy survived it.
They shut down a lot of the medical schools as well because they were substandard as well, weren't they? It had to be based on the John Hopkins standard of education, or it was my understanding, or otherwise, that was it. So whether it was owned by John Hopkins or something like that, I don't know. But there was certainly that they got rid of a lot of the poorer schools. But yes, the osteopathy schools survived, didn't they? Which
yes, I think there were some that were shut down, but it meant that there was more of a degree of kind of control on education. But also, a lot of the osteopathic schools kind of way exceeded the demands, because not only were they actually looking at sort of the pharmaceuticals at the time, albeit from a sort of more of a different perspective of like why we don't use pharmaceuticals, but also, their understanding of anatomy was better than most surgeons. Their analysis of physiology was much broader than most, because they had a kind of hands-on understanding of the application of physiology, if you like, how you can encourage the circulation, how you can, restore the blood to, certain areas, or diminish the blood in organs that are congested and so on. So it's fascinating stuff.
It is. So what was it like being working with Mr. Wernham for so much of your career? As an undergraduate initially, was it a bit scary?
Yeah. No, he at that stage of his life, he was an awe-inspiring character, but quite a scary person, and quite a grumpy old chap. I think he'd had a lot of issues with students in the past. I think he'd had a lot of abuse, both from the profession as a whole and from students. He'd had students stealing stuff from the colleges that he'd been involved with. So, you know, as much as he wanted to get the message over, he didn't have a lot of time for students. But at the same time, you know, it was just totally awe-inspiring. And when he would go through these Little John sort of practice notes and so on, you could tell he you know, he knew what he was talking about. It wasn't just, you know, he was kind of like reading them to us, but then he would like divert into talking about a case that he treated, and occasionally, you know, we would watch him sort of treating. It wasn't until we kind of reignited the course and we were doing the, you know, just doing purely postgraduate, that we really saw the best of what he could do. And he was much kind of easier in himself at that stage. He was sort of in his 90s at that point. And his teaching was like, you know, much more kind of sympathetic, tuned in to sort of students. Would explain, you know, a little bit more. I mean, it's very difficult with somebody with that degree of experience to actually explain what you're doing and your intention, because a lot of it's intuition, a lot of it's just pure feel of tissues, and it's not necessarily something you can easily verbalize. But,
and sometimes, what was it he used to say? Something, ask me the same question next year, come back next year and ask me the same question, or something like that. So in other words, learn a bit more about it and then you won't need to ask me the question, or something along those lines.
Absolutely. Or he would sort of, you know, go back to kind of Little John's words, and very often Little John would sort of in the middle of a text and go, you know, this explains why, and it's like, how does that explain why? And it's like, well, you have to have a knowledge base that's something akin to where they were coming from for it to explain why. There was quite a lot of that going on.
So your knowledge base had to be good enough to be able to understand it in the first place, you know, which is a big part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Your clinic tutor, Kevin Dew.
For most part.
So that was interesting, because you would have had other clinic tutors who would say, oh no, you can't treat that and you can't treat this, but Kevin was not necessarily suggesting that.
Absolutely. No, he was like very supportive, and I remember particularly I had one old lady that came in, and she had a really interesting combination of red flags. She had osteoporosis and gout, and you know, I guess those aren't the kind of pathologies you'd necessarily say you shouldn't, you know, absolutely treat, but you would certainly kind of err on the side of just, you know, very lightweight palliation for fear of either, you know, kind of stirring up the gout, or, you know, certainly not
breaking something.
Exactly. And you know, following kind of Little John's protocols and ways of thinking, discussing this with Kevin, and working, you know, with this sort of, you know, mild, gentle articulation and you know, kind of stimulus through the spine itself to encourage a response in the bony tissue itself. Some of what Little John talks about is like vibration technique, and he would kind of percuss down the way, you know, all the way down through the spine to stimulate, you know, kind of bone response, if you like. And it seemed to work. It seemed to be, you know, and certainly didn't sort of make anything any worse. Certainly helped in terms of discomfort. And that was one of the things that got me, you know, kind of really stirred and interested into taking osteopathy into the realms of you know, treating people with ailments and diseases and disorders.
Were there people there who just wanted to do sort of MSK type stuff and, you know, sort of crack a sacroiliac joint?
Yes, I would say yes, but it was hard to tell as we were learning, you know, where people were going to take it. But certainly, I think, you know, most of us were pretty convinced about what we were doing. I remember there was a student in my year, we were just about to graduate, and one of my colleagues got food poisoning, And he said,
Yeah.
"Oh, would you treat me?" And it's like, well, okay, I'll see what I can do.
Yeah.
And gave him a treatment, not
Yeah.
specifically food, for food poisoning, but I gave him a
Yeah.
treatment, as ever, based on what I could find. And
Yeah.
it's one of those situations where anybody looking on would have described it as a miraculous, because 1 minute
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
as grey as the
Yeah.
thunder
Yeah.
sky,
Yeah.
and the next he was up and getting a cup of tea together and absolutely
Wow.
fine. It was just
Yeah.
how can interacting with bones and muscles and so on
Yeah.
do something like that?
Yeah.
It's the guy's been
Yeah.
poisoned, essentially.
Yeah. 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 That's what's fabulous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm. All right. So, what are your thoughts on the thing called the primary lesion or key lesion? This is a bit of a cheeky one, really, not because it's Stephen Sané's favourite question, and it always irritated me watching him ask people that. But so I thought, well, I should ask people it as well.
It depends kind of what you mean by that, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
We talk in terms of like primary, secondary lesions,
Yeah.
as in, kind of order that they appear. But that's not kind of where that question is going, really, in a sense of the there was a movement in the kind of 20s and 30s to try and zoom into like key lesions so that you could just release a couple of bits of the spine and wham bam, thank you ma'am, the treatment's sort of done. And it achieved a certain response and so on. But what we are trying to do most of the time in sort of the classical approach is usually avoid those key lesions until the end. That's usually the last thing. So, for example, I treated a colleague of mine for an arrhythmia, and I could see that the kind of key lesion to that is in the upper thoracic, and it's where it interferes with the sympathetic influence on the heart and the heart rhythm quite specifically. So I could grasp that it was there, but then it's like, well, where does that fit into the mechanical picture of this person? Where is it in relation to the physiological process itself? So anything to do with the heart, unless it's dire emergency kind of measures, you're going to want to really free up the circulation, go back to Still's kind of artery rule supreme, and open up the circulation, particularly between trunk and periphery, so that any issues with the heart are reduced just by the fact that you're taking the pressure off the heart, in a sense. Also, because it's whenever you're thinking of the heart, you're thinking of it in relation to the circulation as a whole. So that has to be considered, particularly in relation to the vasomotor system. So there's the sympathetic side influencing the vasomotion. So literally this treatment with a guy with the arrhythmia, and he's not the only one I've treated with the arrhythmias, but his was distinctly the kind that's arrhythmia. So it's not following any pattern. It's kind of disordered, which is potentially a worse kind of variety. So the treatment will be through our body adjustment modality, encouraging the circulation to the periphery, again sort of adjusting through the neck and particularly upper cervical in relation to the general circulation, influencing vasomotor centers, higher centers, and then quite a lot of inhibition down through the sympathetic, so 2D to 2L, 2T to 2L, to bring down the sympathetic tone, looking at the mechanics of that pattern that's in the spine that's creating that focal point, dissipating the forces around that, so sort of fascial tensions, postural tensions, the relationship in the different curves, i.e. the neck to the thoracic and the sort of lower thoracic to the upper thoracic. And then literally, the kind of last maneuver is to release that that particular section of the spine. So it's like our approach in classical osteopathy is almost the opposite to what people understand in the approach to sort of dealing with key lesions. And it's, you know, it's what Little John talked about, it's what Wernham did. And also, I mean, you know, I'm not just kind of, you know, regurgitating Mr. Wernham's words, but, you know, he said, you know, keep well away from that approach in osteopathy. When it, you know, kind of came over from the States, essentially, it came over with Fryatt and Hall were both sort of looking into it. They explored it and they experimented with it. And Wernham said that, and sort of, you know, the very kind of, you know, high velocity, abrupt sort of approach. He said that he never had so many problems in his treatment reactions with patients as when they were working like that. And you can, you know,
I can believe that, having done it myself.
Yeah, and I you know, I'm glad that I wasn't trained in that way to have discovered that, because you know, there've been a few occasions where I've kind of maybe resorted to, you know, a little bit kind of, you know, more abrupt or faster sort of like treatment, and always end up going back to sort of, you know, this general approach, this sort of articular. Yes, there's, you know, the manipulation is involved. But it's a very different kind, and it's well prepared, well sort of bedded, and then you kind of release afterwards. It's not, it is not the treatment. It's about releasing kind of key restrictions in, you know, fibrotic tissues and joints that are sort of grossly impacted and so on. But it's always, you know, a part of a treatment. It's, you know, I don't think I've ever applied it in itself, other than, you know, kind of peripheral joints on acute injuries. You know, just oh, there he goes. You know, put it back home again.
So, do you think osteopathy has changed much?
Yes. I mean, you know, if we look at what, you know, Still was doing, and that sort of earliest sort of group of osteopaths, what we find in the profession these days is, you know, this enormous diversity. It's like when a patient asks you what the difference between osteopathy and chiropractic, or osteopathy and physio, it's like, well, it's such a difficult question to answer in so many ways, because there are so many approaches to osteopathy, and same with chiropractic. Now there are so many different sort of approaches, and some are more abrupt and some are much gentler. And so on, but yeah, so there are so many different approaches in the osteopathic profession now. And one of the things, you know, with the institute, when we're getting called upon, you know, by different people with all sorts of different levels of training and experience and so on, some people with a lot of experience, and the key issue is A, understanding that physiological response, and B, the issues that other people have with stabilizing. You know, they can make a bit of a change with somebody, or they can, you know, help and ameliorate somebody's condition, but to stabilize it either on a mechanical basis or a physiological mechanical basis, they struggle. They really struggle to actually get to that point, and that's, you know, that is so important in what we do. And it's not like, you know, we're better than them sort of nonsense. It's you know, it's about the value of what we've been given, and it is so valuable, and that factor of stabilizing a thing is the difference between, you know, somebody constantly, you know, our approach very often will demand the patient comes back, you know, over and over again, but you're not doing the same thing over and over again. It should always be progressive. It's like, you know, the whole idea of maintenance treatment. I don't believe in the concept of maintenance treatment. Even if I saw somebody once a year after hopefully a series of treatments, sort of, you know, improving and stabilizing their condition, that treatment should also be progressive. It shouldn't just be sort of like, you know, okay, well, I haven't seen you for a year, so there's a few sort of twists and turns and tensions there. It should always be progressive. You know, and yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see, you know, how the osteopathic profession is, and it's, you know, it's all of it is, you know, is positive and of benefit and so on, and certainly better than sort of, you know, people having operations and loads of pharmaceuticals in their system. But
Yeah.
I think we're lucky to have been given something that does offer that just a little bit more, a little bit deeper. I say it's not the only approach by any means. There are certainly some great figures in the osteopathic profession, like Caroline Stone and so on, that really do explore the depths of osteopathy from all sorts of different perspectives, and can deal with a huge scope of different things. But it's
she's very interested in Little John
yeah, and
as well.
she's one of the few people that's actually examined the mechanics and then sort of the lines and so on, and come to some valid and intelligent sort of conclusions from it. It's really nice to see that with
What do you think are some of the most important lessons you've learnt along the way in your journey with osteopathy?
basically, as you graduate as a student, you kind of think, oh well, that's it, I've qualified. And the one thing that Mr. Wernham said to us as we left the college, as we graduated, said, "Don't shut your books." And my response to him was like, I hardly felt like I've opened them yet in terms of what there is. So I think one of the first things is to keep studying, keep learning. You can never get to the end of this. You can never get to the end of this. It's like, when they asked Little John, what do you think is the scope of osteopathy? And he says, we don't know yet. Because we haven't found a terminus. There are, I mean, in the early days, it included surgery, so there wasn't kind of a stopping point at any point, in a sense, that they would actually deal with the surgery rather than send somebody on. So that keep learning, and one of the main reasons that I've stayed involved with teaching is to keep learning. I find it in myself difficult to keep motivated to learn things, and outside, to be frank, to be outside of the institute, I've rarely felt inspired by other people's sort of postgraduate education. I mean, I only did a certain amount of certain things, and I certainly would have loved to do various other things. But I found that what Mr. Wernham was still putting over at the time, and that whole sense of what classical osteopathy is, was so valuable in just to keep pursuing. And as I say, there seemed to be no end to it. You could spend all day and all night studying and reading and trying to understand. And I say it was such a privilege to have that kind of direct contact with Mr. Wernham, particularly in the sort of the postgraduate kind of era of all this, and really begin to understand more about what he actually meant when we were undergraduates, and really see his treatment. And one of the things also on that tribute, Chris Campbell talks about having had treatment from Mr. Wernham, and I did myself, and you'd learn so much from having treatment. And that's of course another response to the question is get decent treatment yourself, and even try different people until you settle with somebody that you really think feel is kind of making a mark.
Do you think osteopathic principles are outdated and should be taken out of osteopathy?
Absolutely not. Principles are central to osteopathy. There is no osteopathy without the principles.
How do you use the principles? It's probably actually because you probably do this on autopilot.
Absolutely. I mean, the way, it's not like we were trained in a way and then I've had to think about approaching it in a different way. So, we talk in terms of sort of certain key principles of like, the unity of the body and so on. So, whenever somebody comes to you, suffering or discomfort, whatever, we always consider the bigger picture. So, both in terms of kind of, life influences and environment and so on, but also looking at their whole body as patterns and compensations and, lack of compensation, as in, stress points and strain points, but looking at that bigger picture of them as a whole. So, somebody comes to you with an elbow problem. Well, why is that in trouble? And then you're looking to the relationship, obviously, right the way through the arm and the hand and so on. You're looking to the way they're using their arm. You then relate that through to the, the upper thoracic and, the base of the neck where, the nerve supply is from, and how that, upper thoracic is moving, and how that in turn might be affecting the elbow and so on and so forth. So whatever somebody's presenting, we're always looking at it in terms of like cause and effect. John always spoke about getting to the cause of causes, where you can, getting to the root of things, and that to me is so much an underemphasized kind of osteopathic principle of trying to, find the cause of what's going on. And as much as we can, obviously, relating it to the mechano-physiological, if you like, basis of things, and understanding, relationships. And as I say, that within a sort of global context. Again, I get confused in the profession where people are talking about tensegrity models, which are all about kind of unity, and one thing moves and everything moves with it. Or everything is reliant on sort of, other tensions and compression balances and so on. And then they sort of, approach one part or one tissue within that sort of matrix. And it's like, okay, the body is going to adapt and move around that and settle itself. But why give it that extra work, particularly if somebody's ill or, they're suffering? Why give them more work to do? It's like, when, albeit necessary at times, patients have to see an orthopedic examiner or a surgeon, and they put them through such gross testing that they come out like, 100 times more, discomfort than when they went in. And even with x-rays, I had an older lady go in for x-ray not all that long ago, and she had a problem with her neck, and they had her, in all sorts of positions, and she was an absolute mess when she came out. And it's like, well, can't you find a way of making your machines like line up with her? And that's again, part of our thinking, again, in terms of, kind of global cause and effect, posture and the way people sit and hold and stand and all the rest of it, and their environment. Perhaps your low back is because you've got a lousy couch, or you sit with your feet up underneath you, one side always, all this, etc., etc. Or you're sat in the car all day long where you're twisted, and it's all very easy to sort of think, oh, let's just move that little sacroiliac joint because it's in. But like, why is it in trouble? What's the basis of that, and how can we address that, throughout the totality of the body?
Where do you think evidence-based medicine fits into osteopathy and this demand for evidence? And
I can relate to it on one level. It's very interesting to have, kind of qualified, intelligent understanding of kind of mechanisms in the body, for example. Some of the mechanisms that we relate to as osteopaths, research that sort of shows certain aspects of kind of details of physiology, and also if there is kind of supporting evidence of kind of osteopathic measures, like the work of Lisa Hodgmunden that we had in to the Institute back along, talking about the research that was done on the lymphatic system and on the efficacy of lymphatic treatment. And I was lucky to have the opportunity to give her a treatment that particular session, and discuss like, that would be even more interesting, kind of, valid evidence-based if it was in context of treatment rather than just a lymphatic, technique. So it's like one aspect of it is, I think in a kind of, evidence-based and research and so on. But, the proof of the pudding, so often, as Mr. Wernham used to say, is in the eating, is in, the patients in our clinic. And, we don't have to justify what we do to them in terms of like pulling out a piece of research. They do it on a sensory level of like, are you feeling better? Are you feeling different? And, the other aspect, the other kind of bugbear, if you like, I have with evidence-based medicine as far as osteopathy is concerned, is that it really needs to be approached from a perspective of the person doing the osteopathy in the research context being as proficient and experienced and so on as they can be. And part of our role is not necessarily, as the institute is not necessarily to, provide evidence-based medicine, because we don't necessarily have the resources to do that, but to educate people to be able to, put those treatments into practice and put those elements into practice. If people then want to pursue that as research, and I think it's, I think that's one of the things that sort of an imbalance in the way education and sort of validity of what we do is concerned. If people look back into the roots of the profession, most of our thinking and application has been evidenced. It may have been a century ago, and it may not be sort of contemporary research, but if you actually study what they did and how they did it, as you yourself have done, you'll see that it is, it provides a sound basis. And I think in many senses, the evidence base of osteopathic medicine has actually gone backwards in terms of its evolution. As to be frank, I think a lot of approaches in osteopathy, not denigrating them enormously, but equally the scope of osteopathic practice seems to have diminished rather than kind of expanded as Little John and Still kind of predicted and hoped for and presumed. Those early osteopaths all had this kind of almost kind of evangelical kind of approach to sort of like talking about osteopathy. You find it in all those early writings about the potential of osteopathy. They saw it as a new and effective system of healthcare that was, kind of, almost beyond reproach, if you like. And I've seen, in practice, some of the the interactions that are possible, and how enormously effective osteopathy can be in the realms of a kind of broader sort of approach to healthcare. And it's, I don't feel qualified to sort of like, to walk into a hospital and then sort of be diagnosing this and treating that and so on, like, like we stepped into an episode of ER or something. But on the other hand, I think, as an educational sort of, body, as educationalists, and having some experience of that kind of realm, that's where we need to be kind of heading ourselves, really. Mr. Wernham always had a dream of having an osteopathic hospital, and I in his sort of last days, as it were, I was most peeved that we had to sort of escort him into hospital to spend his last hours in a hospital bed. And the fact that it wasn't an osteopathic hospital, and he had things in his nose and all the rest of it. He hated all that.
I bet.
But it's like, well, what else could we do at that time? And there wasn't an osteopathic hospital in the sense that he understood.
No, and you get to the point with people like that, like I say, like that, someone who you're living with and caring for, where their care actually goes beyond what you're able to do in a home environment. And then they need to be in some kind of facility. But wouldn't it be wonderful if it was an osteopathic one?
Absolutely. I mean, I've I had the chance to be involved in the past with trying to establish a sort of, not necessarily osteopathic, but a kind of nature cure osteopathic kind of hospital. And unfortunately, that plan didn't eventually come to fruition, but it was a very interesting idea, and
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine something more interesting, in terms of approaching kind of work.
Yeah.
It is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, yeah. All right. Do you have any thoughts on the biopsychosocial model?
Yes, very important, kind of educationally understanding kind of relationships of mental, emotional, physical kind of interactions. But one thing people underestimate again about osteopathy is that it is genuinely one of the few systems of healthcare that doesn't holistic. Let me give you an example. We had a student on one of the postgraduate courses who was a lecturer at the British School of Osteopathy, as it was called at the time. And without being too indiscreet, he was suffering from quite a serious bout of grief. He just suffered a loss, and I sent him to see Mr. Wornham, and I said to Mr. Wornham, as I was kind of introducing the idea, what was going on with the guy. And this particular guy couldn't understand, why I'd suggested that, but nevertheless took me up on it. And the guy coming out of, Mr. Wornham's treatment room, was almost like a completely different person than the guy that went in. And it was almost kind of surreal. And it's like, when you have a system which is, genuinely holistic, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, kind of counsel or psychotherapy or, whatever as part of the approach, because when you understand, the mind, body, spirit kind of interrelationship, that, it's all happening, in relation to the body. It's like, we talk about the, the disruptions, the dysfunctions or lesions in the spine. When we look at the osteopathy from this perspective of the sort of, the psychosocial and so on, that the lesion manifestation, the body's sort of morphology, posture, and so on, are all part of, the psychosocial emotional response. And like we refer to the osteopathic lesion or somatic dysfunction, whatever you want to label it, in the spine as being a center of maintained, disturbed kind of physiological, if you like. The same you can say with the kind of mental emotional sphere, that so often, body's disruption on a kind of mental plane is to do with the circulation to the brain, for example. Emotional stuff very often to do with kind of the interaction between different systems, the sympathetic system. Has an effect on certain functions like the heart itself, and then when you look into the physiology of the heart, how important the nerve functions in and around the heart. There's more kind of electromagnetic activity in this area than there is in the brain, and so on. And it's like, it's very easy to sort of have this model, but then think, oh, well, I need to be able to counsel the patient. I need to be able to psychotherapy. I need to be able to do this. And yes, those things can be extremely valuable if you know what you're doing, and if you know how to sort of weave them into the treatment process without overtaxing the patient, without kind of burdening their psychosocial kind of system, if you like.
And it is all treatment from the sensory side still, whether it's counselling or hands-on. It's all stimulation of the afferent system.
Absolutely.
Whether it be through your auditory canal or through your suboccipital space.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there are various people over the years who've brought together some, interesting models of, kind of the mechanisms of these mental, emotional, kind of different sort of realms in relation to the physical. Louisa Burns did, Little John did. There were models in the 1980s that were being used about sort of, the kind of relationship of the the body kind of holding retained reflexes, retained kind of mental, emotional stuff, because it, in a process of everybody's sort of interaction with the world goes through a sort of filter of our kind of higher center experiences, and when we can't necessarily relate to something that's happening mentally, emotionally, or physically, we invent a response, or we go back to an old response that's like programmed from somewhere historically, and isn't necessarily appropriate, etc. It's so I think it's a field that is very valid to study, but I think the more that you study and apply it in terms of the interaction with structural, with postural, with kind of lifestyle, and within the sort of context of understanding that kind of mental, emotional isn't purely to do with what's going on in the cranium, for example. Little John talked about the mind as, if you like, living within the nervous system. It's not just about what's happening in the brain and different chemical reactions and so on. Those are parts of it or results of it, and it's as much to do with the kind of life force that is that person, if you like. And the more we can engage in that, like Stills talked about, engaging with a soul, engage with that person, rather than just this sort of pile of bricks that we call bones, etc., etc. So I think this is it's a hugely important part of osteopathy, and should be, like many other parts of osteopathy, studied and kind of held in the background. And if you have the skills and knowledge, I'm getting, the internet is unstable again. If you have those skills and knowledges to actually sort of interact intelligently, life coaching, or however you approach it, maybe homeopathy, then great, and I do at times. There are times when I'll just simply kind of, very often, will just listen to a person and just sort of make kind of appropriate sort of therapeutic noises, or encourage them to talk, or encourage them to identify the feelings that go with that. But it's not my training, it's just the experience and sort of studies and so on. And likewise, I'll use simple first aid homeopathic remedies if somebody comes in suffering as a result of a grieving experience. There are simple kind of homeopathic remedies that help with that. And so on. People sort of suffering from trauma, again, encouraging people just to talk and engage with their kind of emotions, but always in the context of encouraging them to breathe, and encouraging to release the sort of the postural aspect, and the what we refer to as the lesion pattern that's going with it.
That's fantastic. Anything else you want to add, Chris?
To that, or general?
And generally, anything else you want to say about anything? Because I think what you've actually said through this is fantastic, and I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's going to make a fabulous podcast.
Yeah, it's good just to sort of like you say, I mean, kind of prime with a few questions, but also just to sort of like carry on with where the flow goes. And I mean, and I think for this kind of podcast thing, I've listened to a few lately, and you see that I bunged one up onto that group chat about the sensory nerves. That was fascinating. I just put it. I quite often, if I go for a walk, I'll put my wireless headphones on, and I'll have some science program on Radio 4, just generally, but this was particularly this sort of research on the sort of medical sphere, and I thought that is so osteopathic in terms of it. But
there is a lot of osteopathy, and well, I think a lot of medicine has taken a lot from osteopathy over the years, and not actually realised they've done it.
Still was one of the first to intelligently use X-rays. So as soon as that sort of science had evolved, they were there, and they were using it.
Yeah.
They invented the iron lung in Kirksville, which was like
wow.
which saved like colossal lives during sort of like the polio
1950s and stuff.
that was going around and so on, and all sorts of things, all sorts of measures that people don't come aren't aware of, and also sort of the characters sort of historically that have experienced osteopathic treatment, from Mark Twain,
Bertrand Russell.
And then the comments of Bertrand Russell are always, some of my favorite kind of quotes. You're in good hands, even an osteopath. These kind of things.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. It's really good of you to give your time. Probably take me a week or so to get on top of the editing of that. And also, thank you everyone for tuning in. If you'd like any more information about classical osteopathy or the Institute of Classical Osteopathy, please go to our website, which is www.classical-osteopathy.org. And once again, thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye.